Hi, everybody. Today I will be comparing Byzantine Orthodox Christian and Japanese Zen and Shingon Buddhist monastic communities' understanding of homosexuality within their own communities. And we're going to be looking into how these monasteries, like as I said, understood homosexuality, but also regulated and sometimes even accommodated it. And we're going to look into how we can use this to understand how these communities saw how homosexuality, desire, discipline, and the sacred life all kind of interacted with each other. In all these communities, in both these communities, their monasticism is kind of built on a renunciate type of lifestyle. So in the Byzantine Orthodox tradition, homosexuality being present in the monastic communities was openly acknowledged, even though these communities are supposed to be kind of an escape from desire. So historian Derek Kruger describes how Byzantine monasteries act as a sort of queer space or an architecture of same-sex desire. So monasteries are treated same-sex desire not as like a rare exception, but as kind of just a fact of life in terms of living in a male communal space. So Byzantine monastic communities documented this and they wrote rules about it and they even preached against it. And we'll be looking into these rules to demonstrate how they understand homosexuality within the monastic life. For Japanese and Zen and Shingon monasteries, they were also equally aware of the same-sex desire, but their awareness took a different cultural form. So, in Bernard Frare's research, he documents that male love, also known as nanshoku, was so widespread in Japanese monasteries that it became for European observers, as we see in this quote, the defining moral scandal of Japanese Buddhism. And this obviously from their Christian perspective, but they see that the how common homosexual relationships were as like a moral issue with Japanese Buddhism. So unlike the Byzantine tradition, which treated same-sex desire as a persistent spiritual danger, Japanese Buddhist monasticism had in significant ways normalized it. The two traditions diverged most sharply in how they reacted to same-sex desire. Byzantine Orthodox monasticism viewed it as like a grave moral sin or like a offense against God that endangered the soul in the community. And the quote I have kind of acts as an example of this. And it's pretty much John Climax writing how that even if they're escaping cross-sex desire, the enemy or the devil is kind of tempting them with the same-sex desire within these monastic communities. And so the monks have to kind of like be aware and fight against that. And it also shows how morally grave homosexuality is thought of in this community. Japanese and Zen and Shingon monasticism operated from a fundamentally different framework. The Vinaya, which, as we know, is the Buddhist monastic law, is more concerned with the unity of the Sangha which is the monastic community, rather than offending God, because as we know, Buddhism does not have a God to offend. Thus, the Buddhist framework is more about functionality and maintaining the unity of the Sangha rather than just appeasing God. So the quote I provided is Frare citing another scholar who's an expert in the Vinaya, and it's pretty much just saying that the kind of rules and regulations that are provided for are less concerned with the sin itself or the sinner rather than just the relations of the sinner with the community, aka the monastic community. So there's no talk of absolution or pardon because these concepts are just not a part of the Buddhist framework. Rules and regulations that they made surrounding homosexuality is about managing the community, and it's this distinction between Byzantine Orthodox and the Japanese Buddhist monastic communities uh, that shows how differently homosexuality was experienced and regulated in these monastic traditions. And through my research, I've also found that Kruger has been able to find in what he calls, or in his words, manuals for managing attraction within the Orthodox Buddhist community. So these are just rules like the one I have. There's if someone whispers affectionately to another monk, then they both should be separated so that they desist from each other. We also see rules like not looking at other monks in the eyes, or similar to the rule I just said, is not staying next to a monk who they are attracted to. And this shows how monasteries were designing their codes through the understanding that desire was just a constant reality in this male communal space. And because it's or because it's a constant reality, it's in constant need of management. For Japanese Buddhist monasteries, they had a different institutional response. So rather than building codes against it, they built a culture around it. So FRA documents that relationships between senior and young novices, or senior monks and young novices, known as Jigo and Kashiki, generated things like love poetry, romantic fiction, even written theological justifications on why these relationships are permitted. And at some point, male love became kind of understood as a privilege of monastic life, and the practice spread outward from temples into things like samurai culture and beyond. And even though homosexuality was so prevalent in these communities, they still had rules, but these rules were addressing a completely different problem than the Byzantine rules did. These rules were more about, rather than prohibiting like in avoiding the desire, it's more about, as I explained, more focused on just making sure that the monks weren't really fighting with each other over like young novices, for example. And so like the example I gave is exactly about that. Hojo Sadatoki banned novices from coming into monasteries because the monks were just competing with each other over these young men, and it was disrupting the monastic order. Underlying both of these traditions, relationships to male same-sex desires, is a kind of a deeper logic rooted in how each tradition constructs gender and the spiritual status of the female body. So in Byzantine Orthodox monasticism, Kruger argues that male celibacy was understood as a form of hypermasculinity, and that to renounce women was not to become feminized, it was to demonstrate supreme self-mastery, which is the highest expression of Christian manhood. And this quote kind of gets to that where they use things that are predominant or typically associated with masculinity, athletics and the military, and they use those metaphors to frame the monastic experience. So this kind of shows how like monks are understanding themselves as warriors fighting like in a spiritual battle against desire, whether it be cross sex or same sex desire. And this battle was the ultimate test of their masculine virtue. Japanese Buddhist monasticism operated from a pretty similar or parallel logic, but it was still distinct. It was more about avoiding, rather than self mastery, avoiding spiritual defilement. Monastic same sex relationships were sometimes understood not as just like acceptable, but as spiritually preferable to cross sex relationships because they avoided the defilement associated with the female body. And this logic can be seen in the quote I provided and reads, inasmuch as a woman meant defilement, by rejecting women, even if for young boys, monks thought they were rejecting defilement. So in some strands of Japanese Buddhist thought, male love was not seen as a falling to desire or a disciplinary failure. It seen as just like a more spiritually rational choice. It kept the monk pure from being contaminated by contact with femininity. But in this framework, same-sex relationships were tolerated and for some even, as I said, spiritually justified. Both traditions ultimately share one final feature, and it's just a persistent, institutionally acknowledged gap between their official positions on homosexuality and the reality of the monastic lives that they governed. So in Byzantine Orthodoxy, treated same-sex desire as structural and near universal in monastic life. And Kruger even argues that to describe Byzantine monasticism without giving a central place to men's desires for other men is to fundamentally misunderstand how Byzantine monks constructed and understood their own lives. In Japanese Shingon and Zen traditions, the gap went further. Same sex relations came to be seen by some, as I mentioned, a kind of quasi privileged monastic life. They spread beyond the monastery, which is quite a far cry from the renunciant life that was supposed to be expected of monks. And in the future, my research, I have two guiding questions, and they were Will we find these similar understandings and rules surrounding homosexuality in other Christian and Buddhist traditions? And the other one is, are there other important texts within these traditions that we can further examine to understand how they fully understand same-sex desire and how they use these like texts to regulate same-sex desire? Thank you for listening.